For decades, psychologists, detectives, and true crime enthusiasts have tried to answer the question, why do serial killers kill? Their motivations span from power, excitement, and revenge to sexual gratification and mental illness. While many of them end up being infamous for their heinous crimes, very rarely do serial killers get started for that intended purpose. The same could not be said for John Knowles, a killer who documented his crimes in an audio journal, hoping they could one day be used for a book or a movie. Often compared to Ted Bundy and even nicknamed the Casanova Killer for his good looks, Paul never gained as much notoriety. However, some people considered his crimes to be just as bad, if not worse. In today's video, we're going to discuss the life and crimes of John Knowles and how his reign of terror finally came to an end right here in Georgia. On November 7, 1974, journalist Sandy Fox arrived in Atlanta on business. She was traveling to different cities to meet with various publications, the first being in Washington and the second at Atlanta Journal-Constitution office in Georgia. Instead of turning in for the night to prepare for her morning meeting, Sandy decided to grab a drink in the hotel bar at the Holiday Inn where she was staying. While sitting alone, a man approached her and asked her to dance. He was good-looking, around 6 feet tall, and had hair that matched the color of her brandy. She told the man, who introduced himself as Daryl Golden, that she'd rather just relax after having been traveling all day. However, after a few more drinks, she finally took the handsome stranger up on his offer. The two talked for several hours, and Sandy told him that the next day, she needed to find a way to get to West Palm Beach, Florida to meet with another newspaper company. In a strange coincidence, Daryl said he was traveling to Miami and could give her a ride. He said that it would be a short drive and riding together would be more fun. Sandy accepted the proposition, but jokingly said that even though she'd accept the ride, she wasn't going to sleep with him. A few more drinks made her change her mind about that as well, and by the end of the night, the two ended up in her hotel room. Before sleeping together, she joked again that she barely knew anything about him, and for all she knew, he could be the Boston Strangler or something. Even though they both laughed, Sandy had no idea that her comment wasn't far from the truth. The next day on their drive to Florida, Sandy and Daryl talked about their childhoods, which were surprisingly similar. Both came from abusive and neglectful families, but Sandy channeled her trauma by becoming a successful journalist. Daryl seemed particularly interested in the fact that she was a writer, and strangely brought up the idea of her writing a book about him and his life. He said that he had recorded tapes that were now locked away in a vault with his lawyer, and that they would make for a really interesting story. Sandy asked what was on the tapes, but Daryl said that she wouldn't be able to listen to them while he was still alive. She didn't really know what to make of that comment and figured that he was just trying to impress her by seeming more interesting and mysterious. By November 10th, the two arrived in West Palm Beach. Daryl drove Sandy to the meeting she had with the newspaper, and even waited for her to get finished. They spent the next several days together hitting up bars in the area for Sandy to network with local writers. It was like one of those whirlwind vacation romances, exciting and passionate but short-lived. Well, passionate on Daryl's end at least, because Sandy would later go on to say that the sex actually wasn't that very good. To put it nicely, Daryl wasn't able to perform, but even Sandy's new writer friends made comments about how clearly into her he was. However, she needed to get back to actual business and had a few article deadlines coming up. Sandy had to break it to Daryl that it was time for them to go their separate ways, and even though they barely knew each other, he seemed a little heartbroken. Before they parted, Sandy asked again if he'd tell her what was on those tapes, but Daryl said no. It wouldn't be long for her to piece together the reason why. The next day, Sandy received a message at her hotel from the West Palm Beach Police Department. They said that they needed her to come to the police station and that it was urgent. She thought that Daryl had possibly been in a car accident, but in reality the news was much worse. When she arrived, she was brought to a room by a detective and asked if she knew a woman named Susan McKenzie. She and Daryl had briefly met her out at the bar. She was the wife of one of the local writers Sandy had been networking with. After she had explained and asked why, the detective said, "Well, your friend tried to rape her this morning." Sandy sat in shock as they told her that Daryl had offered the woman a ride to a hair appointment, but pulled the car over demanding that she have sex with him. She refused and tried to get out of the car, but he pulled out a gun and began yanking her back in by her hair. She was thankfully able to escape and went to a nearby payphone to call the police, and was brought in to give a detailed description of him and the car he was driving, a red Chevy Impala. From there, detectives radioed all local law enforcement to be on the lookout for the vehicle. In a stroke of luck, an officer on patrol spotted a Chevy matching its description and turned on his lights to get it to pull over. However, as he got out to speak to the driver, Daryl rushed out of the car brandishing a sawed-off shotgun. As the officer raced behind his patrol car to take cover, Daryl was able to escape. Now that he knew the police were onto him, Daryl found a covered carport to ditch the car and took off on foot. He needed a place to hide and made his way to a home in a nearby neighborhood. There, he approached a woman hanging clothes on the line in her backyard. He told her that he was an IRS agent named Bob Williams, but the woman, a 31-year-old named Beverly Maybe, who suffered from cerebral palsy, could tell that he was lying. She tried to rush into her house, but he pushed the door in and closed it behind them. He pulled out his gun and told her not to worry, that he had just committed a robbery and needed a place to hide out for a little while. He asked Beverly who else lived in the house, and she told him her nephew and her twin sister, Barbara, who was at work until around 5:30. Bob, aka Daryl, asked Beverly where her sister worked, and she told him she was a copywriter for a radio station. He told Beverly that if she cooperated, he wouldn't hurt her, and just needed to wait for her sister to get home with the car so that he could use it to escape. However, that ended up being a lie. While they waited, he tied up Beverly. Even though with cerebral palsy, she wasn't strong enough to fight him off anyway, and proceeded to sexually assault her. When Barbara's son got home from school, he tied him up in his bedroom as well. Finally, when Barbara came home from work, she walked into the door only to be greeted by Bob pointing a gun at her. She didn't try to run because she knew her sister and her son were in the house. He directed her with the gun upstairs where she found Beverly tied up on the bed. Barbara began begging for him not to hurt them and said that she had just cashed her paycheck and could give him all of the money and the keys to her car. Bob did want the car and the money, but he didn't want to leave alone. He forced her downstairs and outside to her car, a brown Volkswagen Beetle, and said, "You're coming with me to Georgia." During Barbara and Beverly's ordeal, the police were able to locate the red Chevy Impala Daryl/Bob ditched under the carport. They were able to quickly find out that the license plate had been stolen off of another vehicle and didn't belong to a man named Daryl Golden either. About a half hour after Barbara was taken from her home, her son and sister Beverly were able to untie themselves and went to a neighbor's house to call 911. They frantically explained what just happened and gave the description of the man who attacked them. The police recognized that Bob's description matched the description of Daryl, who had attempted to assault Susan McKenzie earlier that morning. Now that they knew he was involved in a kidnapping, the West Palm Beach police were able to get the FBI involved. Their focus turned to locating the brown Volkswagen as soon as possible, in hopes that Barbara would be okay. Since the license plate didn't actually belong to the Chevy, the FBI decided to run the VIN number on the vehicle. It was registered to a man named Richard Evans in Ohio, who along with his car had been reported missing several weeks prior. Ohio police had been trying to find Richard and his car by tracking his credit card transactions, which had been used in nearly 37 different states. During their investigation, they discovered that the handwriting on the credit card receipts didn't actually match Richard's handwriting, meaning that someone was using his card and identity. The FBI decided to look into the name Daryl Golden, as this was the name their suspect had given Sandy Fox and Susan McKenzie. However, when they located the real Daryl Golden, while he was alive and well, he too had recently reported that his credit card had been stolen. Their suspect was obviously stealing cars, credit cards, and changing identities quickly. That only meant that Barbara Maybe was in even more danger. Since their original priority had been to try to find out who the Chevy Impala belonged to, they had only briefly gone through the items they'd found inside the car. At first, it seemed like just a bunch of trash, just some old newspapers and clothing tags from stores in Georgia, but upon further inspection, they actually found one single document that would push their investigation forward. A piece of paper, dated only a few days prior, appeared to be a will. On the will was the name Paul John Knowles. Finally, the police and FBI believed they knew the name of their suspect. They quickly did a background check, locating an ID photo of Paul. They brought this photo to Beverly, who identified him as the man who attacked her and kidnapped her sister Barbara. They knew for sure that Paul John Knowles was the man involved in their attack, as well as Susan's. With investigators from several states now working together, the agent who had been working to locate Richard Evans out of Ohio went to a local hotel where his credit card had recently been used. There he noticed an abandoned car with Florida plates, which he thought was suspicious considering that their suspect Paul had just been to Florida. After running the license plate on the vehicle, he discovered that it actually belonged to a Jacksonville woman who had recently been murdered. He was able to get a fingerprint off the car, which matched fingerprints belonging to Paul in the Florida criminal database. Not only were they dealing with identity theft, car theft, and sexual assault, they were dealing with a potential murderer. Barbara was still trapped in her car headed to Georgia with Paul, and with these new revelations, things weren't looking good. On their drive north, Barbara attempted to make small talk with Paul, hoping that by engaging in conversation and even developing a friendship with her captor, that this could help keep her alive. That's when Paul asked Barbara about her career and said that her sister mentioned that she was a writer. Even though Barbara only did copywriting for a radio station, Paul asked her if she thought she had the skills to write a book. She noticed his demeanor change, and he almost seemed excited as he explained that he wanted her to write a book about his life. It was almost identical to the conversation he had with Sandy Fox just a few days before, except for this time, Paul went into detail about the story he was hoping to tell. The details disturbed Barbara, and it was then she truly started to fear for her life. Paul John Knowles was born to parents Thomas and Bonnie Knowles on April 14, 1946 in Orlando, Florida. It's been said that the family was very poor, and Paul, along with his 4 siblings, were severely neglected and physically abused by their father.
In today's climate, we would all been taken out of the home. We would all been taken out of the home and probably fostered out. There was a lot of physical abuse. My father would call them, he called them whipping. I called them beatings myself. You know, when you leave black and blue marks on a kid from the belt, that's a beating. And the old man was beating Paul with his fist. And he was about to beat him to death. He got well enough, he ran away again.
He had a much stronger love and bond with his mother, but Paul was known to have behavior problems in school from a young age, probably acting out due to his father's treatment. He apparently had a very hard time dealing with authority and rejection, even punching a fellow classmate in the face after she turned him down. At just 7 years old, Paul committed his first crime of stealing a bicycle. Rather than trying to guide his son or discipline him in a normal way, his father Thomas basically just threw up his hands. He gave Paul up to live in foster care, and from there, he was in and out of different homes and reformatories. One of these reformatories was called the Dozier School for Boys, which was later shut down after a federal investigation revealed horrific treatment towards the inmates. Troubled boys between the ages of 5 and 20 years old were said to have been beaten, tortured, and in some cases even killed at the Dozier School. This treatment didn't do much reforming, and many of the boys who spent time there went on to struggle even more into adulthood, with others even taking their own lives. Even though Paul harbored feelings of abandonment and resentment towards his father for sending him away, and his mother for letting it happen, he still always hoped that he could make them proud. However, by the time he was able to move on from the Dozier School, he hadn't developed any positive life skills or coping mechanisms and immediately picked back up with committing crimes. At age 19, Paul had his first arrest as an adult and spent roughly 6 months of each year thereafter in jail for crimes ranging from burglary, assault, and auto theft. During one of these stints in jail, in 1972, Paul became pen pals with a woman from California named Angela Kovic, after finding her contact information in a magazine called American Astrology. The two remained in touch over the next couple of years, especially when Paul was behind bars and had a lot of extra time on his hands to write letters. In 1974, he was serving a 3-year sentence for burglary when Angela began confiding in him about trouble she was experiencing in her marriage. That's when their letters took a romantic tone, and Paul claimed that he would make an excellent lover. Even though she wasn't technically divorced, when Paul asked Angela to marry him, she said yes. On paper, the two seemed head over heels in love, but Angela was significantly older than Paul, and some people think that the only reason he was interested in her was because she came from money. She also told him that she would do everything she could to try to get him out of prison, so that he could come to California to live with her and start a life together. Angela did some research and ended up finding a successful defense attorney out of Miami named Sheldon Yavitz. She paid him $5,000, and Sheldon was able to convince a judge to let Paul out on parole. Now, I mentioned earlier that Angela and Paul met via an astrology magazine, and in addition to astrology, Angela often sought advice from psychics as well. Before Paul arrived to be with her, she decided to go see one of her trusted psychics. However, the prediction she was given surprised her. The psychic warned Angela that a very dangerous man would be entering her life soon, and unfortunately, these predictions were turned out to be correct. At first, Angela didn't believe that the psychic could have possibly been referring to Paul in her predictions. Based on his letters, He was sweet, caring, and she couldn't see the man she fell in love with as being dangerous. However, once Paul finally arrived in California, Angela reportedly began to feel uneasy about him almost instantly. She had gone out of her way to find him a job, but he didn't seem at all interested in working. Not only that, his promises of being an excellent lover fell short, and Angela started to wonder if she had made a mistake leaving her husband. Within 4 days of Paul being in California, Angela decided to call off their engagement and told him that she wanted to try to repair her marriage. Paul had no choice but to return home, but it seems like his split from Angela sparked something inside him, other than just heartbreak. On his way back to Florida, Paul decided to stop in Macon, Georgia to visit an ex-girlfriend, Jackie Knight. For Paul, Jackie was one of those women who was always there for him when he needed her, and was quite possibly one of his only true friends. Over the years, he helped babysit her children, visited on Christmas, and Jackie was one of the few people Paul genuinely cared about.
He always protected us. He wouldn't let nobody talk ugly around us.
Jackie Knight fell for the man who charmed many women. She says the two met 4 or 5 years before John Knowles started his killing spree and had no clue what he would become.
He would see to it that the kids had Christmas. He would see to it that they was well taken care of when it came to school. He took those kids as his own.
However, he wasn't always honest with Jackie, and had she known what he had been up to between visits, it's doubtful that she would have kept him in her life, let alone around her children. Jackie knew that Paul was deeply upset about his breakup with Angela, but what she hadn't known was that while on his way back to the East Coast, he murdered 3 people in a fit of rage. Paul now had a taste for blood, and this was just the beginning of what would turn into a 4-month-long cross-country murder spree. When Paul arrived back in Florida, he found himself in a Jacksonville bar with no sense of direction. That night, he drunkenly got into a fight and ended up stabbing a bartender, immediately landing himself back in jail. However, this time, Paul had no plans of staying in jail long, and on July 26th, he was able to pick the lock on his holding cell and escape. This wouldn't be the last time Paul would get himself out of clutches of law enforcement, but had it been, countless lives could have been saved. From there, Paul needed to get his hands on some money and a car. He broke his way into the home of an elderly retired school teacher named Alice Curtis. He bound and gagged her before ransacking her home in search of money and valuables. Before he could actually kill her himself, Alice ended up choking on her own dentures as she was gagged lying face down. He spent a few days in her home relaxing and eating her food before leaving in her car. As his photos started showing up on TV for escaping from jail, he thought it might be best to just leave Florida yet again. On his way out of town, Paul decided to switch cars one more time, just in case Alice was found dead and her vehicle was reported stolen. However, 2 girls that he recognized saw him driving down a quiet residential street while searching for a place to ditch the car. 11-year-old Lillian Anderson and her 7-year-old sister, Mylette. They were actually daughters of one of his mother's friends. Since the girls saw him, he got paranoid that they might notify the police. Paul decided to kidnap and strangle the girls before dumping their bodies in a swamp just outside of town. The following day, Paul broke into the home of a woman named Marjorie Howe in Atlantic Beach. He used a nylon stocking to strangle her before stealing her TV. As he made his way north, he picked up an unknown teenage hitchhiker and ended up sexually assaulting and strangling her as well. After arriving in Musella, Georgia on August 23rd, Paul broke into the home of a woman named Kathy Pierce and strangled her with a telephone cord in front of her 3-year-old son. Even though Paul's rampage was escalating, he thankfully allowed the child to live. By September 3rd, Paul had driven all the way to Ohio. In a tavern, he met a businessman named Richard Evans, and they shared a few drinks before Paul strangled him and abandoned his body in some nearby woods. He stole Richard's money, credit cards, and car, a red Chevy Impala, which he used to drive all the way back to California. On his drive, he passed through Utah and stopped briefly in Ely, Nevada. It was there that he murdered campers Emmett and Lois Johnson on September 18th. There really was no rhyme or reason for this murder. Paul was now killing out of sheer enjoyment. Just 3 days later, while passing through Sequin, Texas, Paul noticed a woman stranded on the side of the road. He offered to help her, but instead raped and strangled her before dragging her body through a barbed wire fence. On September 23rd, Paul arrived in Birmingham, Alabama, where he met a beautician named Ann Dawson. She joined him on his road trip for a few days before he got tired of her company and killed her on September 29th. For nearly a month, Paul managed not to kill anyone else, but used Richard's stolen credit card to travel through Oklahoma, Missouri, Iowa, and Minnesota. By October 19th, he was itching for another fix and broke into the home of a 53-year-old woman named Doris Hovey in Woodford, Virginia. He shot her with her husband's own rifle and then wiped it of any fingerprints before heading back on the road. From there, Paul decided to head back to Florida and made his way all the way down to Key West. There, he picked up 2 hitchhikers, but his plan to kill them was unexpectedly thrown off when Paul got pulled over in a routine traffic stop. Even though no one had put together that he was on a nationwide killing spree, Paul was a wanted man in Florida. Unfortunately, the police officer didn't seem to recognize him as the escapee from Jacksonville. If he had, more lives could have been saved, because after the officer let Paul go on a warning, his murder spree continued. The police encounter in the Keys must have rattled Paul, because just a few days later, his old defense attorney Sheldon Yavitz received an unexpected call. They hadn't spoken in months, but Paul was now asking to meet as soon as possible to discuss something important. It was hard to shock Sheldon, who had defended drug smugglers, hardened gang members, and thieves, but when he met up with Paul at a local Miami bar, the conversation caught him completely off guard. He told Sheldon to brace himself, before revealing that he was a serial killer. Sheldon, of course, didn't believe him at first. Even though he knew Paul was a burglar, he had always been so nice and mild-mannered, and didn't even cuss. Now all of a sudden he was a murderer? However, when he began describing some of his crimes in detail, Sheldon started to get nervous, and even a little scared. Paul said that he had recently been making voice recordings to document his crimes, basically like an audio journal. He wanted Sheldon to keep the tapes to be used for a future book or movie. Sheldon encouraged Paul to turn himself in, but he said he had no intention of doing that. Basically, Paul wanted to be infamous and planned on going out in a blaze of glory, kind of like Bonnie and Clyde. During their conversation, Paul also mentioned that he wanted whatever money was made to sell his story to be saved and given to his parents. It was like he had this mentality that if he couldn't make his parents proud, at least he could make them rich. However, Sheldon either didn't have the heart or was afraid to tell him that things don't exactly work that way. Courts don't allow killers to directly make money off of their crimes, and if they do sell their story, families of the victims can sue to receive any profits. Regardless, Paul knew that many of the murders, which he referred to as his successes, were committed in death penalty states, and his days were numbered. He told Sheldon to keep the tapes locked away until after his inevitable death, and Sheldon agreed. Morally, with the tapes now in his possession, Sheldon should have taken them to the police and turned Paul in himself. However, one of the reasons he was such a successful defense attorney was his loyalty to his clients and his oath to protect attorney-client privilege. He decided not to listen to the tapes until after Paul's death, or at least until after he was caught. After this, Paul made his way back to Georgia to visit with Jackie again before continuing his reign of terror. While in Macon on November 6th, Paul made friends with a man named Carswell Carr and was invited to stay the night at his home. They shared a few drinks before Paul decided to stab Carswell to death. Not only that, but he went on to strangle his 15-year-old daughter and attempted to sexually defile her corpse. It's also believed that during this stint in Macon, he killed 2 hitchhikers named Edward Hillard and Debbie Griffin. It was after this that Paul made his way to Atlanta, where he met Sandy Fox in the hotel bar of the Holiday Inn. Of course, we already know that they traveled back to Florida together, where Paul attempted to assault Susan McKenzie and kidnapped Barbara Mabee. And he was right about his days being numbered, because law enforcement everywhere were keeping their eyes peeled for Barbara's brown Volkswagen Beetle, praying that she was still alive. Even though Paul told Barbara that they were headed back to Georgia, they ended up stopping to rest at a motel in Fort Pierce, Florida. That night, Paul attempted to sexually assault Barbara countless times, but she said that he was unable to complete the act, if you know what I mean.
It didn't even cross my mind that I would be raped. He had raped me repeatedly over and over, but it wasn't rape in my mind because the man wasn't normal. He was not normal that way, sexually. It wasn't like a real man. He wasn't like a real man. He was trying but couldn't do anything. Impotent.
When Paul finally fell asleep, Barbara turned on the TV and saw her face on the evening news. She felt some comfort that everyone was looking for her, but knew that the only way to get out of this situation alive was to save herself. In order to get on Paul's good side, the next day Barbara pretended to be in love with him and even acted excited to help write a book about his life. This may be exactly what made Paul decide to spare her life, but when he needed to leave the motel room for a little while, he bound and gagged her, just in case. However, What he didn't realize was that he forgot to take the key, and when he returned, he was unable to get back into the room. He spoke to Barbara through the door and said, "I know you're gagged and can't talk. I have to go. I love you." Over the next several hours, Barbara did everything she could to wiggle her way out of the binding and spit the gag out of her mouth. When she was finally able to move, she called the front desk at the motel and told them what happened. Police arrived shortly, and Barbara was miraculously able to reunite with her son and sister. Now that he had multiple escaped victims and his face was all over the news, Paul knew he needed to get rid of Barbara's car as soon as possible. On November 16th, a Florida Highway State Trooper named Charles Campbell was on patrol in the city of Perry, not far from the Georgia border. That was when he stopped a brown Volkswagen Beetle, which by that point, everyone was on the lookout for. He followed behind the car and turned his lights on to get it to pull over. Similar to when Paul had been pulled over in the stolen Chevy Impala, he got out of the car ready for a fight. However, this time he was unarmed, and Trooper Charles Campbell wasn't backing down. Charles pulled out his pistol and told Paul to put his hands up, but instead, Paul rushed toward him and the two engaged in a violent struggle. Paul was able to wrestle the gun away from Charles and ordered him to get into the back seat of his own patrol car. Paul knew he didn't have much time left and wanted to squeeze in as much carnage as possible before his spree came to an end. He used the patrol car to his advantage by turning on the lights and sirens in order to pull over an unsuspecting driver named James Meyer. He would take James with him as a second hostage and leave Trooper Campbell's police belt and ID in the back of James's car. When police noticed James's car abandoned on the side of the road, they stopped to check it out. They found Trooper Campbell's belongings and knew he must have been taken hostage. There is no evidence of blood, so investigators were hopeful that he'd be found alive. With one of their own now in danger, the entire state was going to pull out all of the stops to find them. They had no idea that Paul had already driven the men to Pulaski County in Georgia, forced them into the woods, handcuffed them to a tree, and then shot them in the head. Police all across the state were told to be on the lookout for Trooper Campbell's stolen patrol car, a 1974 blue Gran Torino. By Sunday, November 17th, multiple roadblocks had been set up throughout North Florida, South Georgia, and Southeast Alabama, but it was finally in Henry County where Sheriff Deputy Charles Hancock spotted the car. Barreling through the cities of McDonough and Stockbridge, a chase ensued before Paul finally reached a dead end, headed straight into one of the roadblocks. However, he wasn't ready to give up just yet, and instead of pulling over, he rammed the Torino head-on into a barricade at an intersection on Highway 42 on Hudson Bridge Road. An officer in the front of the barricade was launched 20 feet into the air, and dozens of officers drew their weapons, waiting for Paul to emerge from the total Torino. He jumped out of the car and took off running. Under a hail of gunfire, a bullet clipped Paul in the foot before he disappeared into the woods. He was hurt from the crash and the gunshot, but he was still armed and incredibly dangerous. On the news, residents in Henry County and nearby areas were informed of the manhunt and encouraged to stay indoors. Helicopters, bloodhounds, and more than 200 officers and FBI agents on foot scoured the area. About 4 hours later, a Vietnam War veteran named Terry Clark was standing in his backyard after having just returned home from a hunting trip. That's when he noticed an exhausted and haggard-looking man emerging from the woods on his property. It was Paul, the man everyone was looking for, and he was holding a gun. Paul attempted to shoot Terry, but thankfully, the gun jammed. He had no choice but to surrender to the veteran, who quickly armed himself as well. Terry didn't own a phone, so he forced Paul at gunpoint to walk to a nearby neighbor's house where he could call the police. He was quickly taken into custody, but that's not where the story ends. After getting Paul treated for his injuries, he was cleared by the hospital and brought in for questioning. It was there that Paul decided to tell investigators that he was actually responsible for nearly 35 murders, and also told them about his audio journal he had given to his attorney, Sheldon Yavitz. At that point, investigators were still unaware that Paul had killed Trooper Charles Campbell and his other hostage, James Meyer. But in an attempt to keep some semblance of control over the situation, Paul refused to say where they were. Investigators were hopeful that the tapes Paul left with his attorney could provide some insight into what happened to them, and perhaps other victims as well, but Sheldon refused to hand them over, citing his attorney-client privilege. Sheldon was then brought to court before a judge who ordered a subpoena for the tapes. However, Sheldon held strong onto his convictions as a defense attorney and continued to refuse. Since the tapes were locked away in Sheldon's Miami home, not only was he put in jail for contempt of court, they also jailed his wife Patsy after she invoked the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. Even though Sheldon felt like this was a form of extortion, he didn't want his wife to be sitting in jail for something that she hadn't been involved in, so he finally agreed to turn over the tapes and was released after spending nearly 45 days behind bars. However, it turns out the investigators didn't even need the tapes to locate Trooper Campbell and James Meyer because, Only a few days later, they were found dead in the woods by a hunter. At first, Paul was formally charged with 7 murders and was transferred to the Douglas County Jail, where investigators worked to gather more evidence. It was there Paul offered to lead them back to Henry County to locate the murder weapon that belonged to Trooper Charles Campbell. In reality, Paul had other plans. On December 18, 1974, they were headed down on I-20 when Paul used a paperclip to open up his handcuffs. In the back of the car, he reached over into the front seat, attempting to grab the sheriff's revolver. During a violent struggle for the gun, the car veered off the road and smashed into a fence, just as the other officer in the vehicle managed to pull out his gun. As per his wish, Paul John Knowles was shot dead, just like Bonnie and Clyde. Given the fact that Paul decided to keep Sandy Fox and Barbara Maybe alive while also providing Sheldon Yavis with detailed accounts of his crimes, it appears that his main objective really was for someone to tell his story. Whether this was an act of narcissism brought on by trauma and rejection, or if he really did want to make his parents rich, unfortunately for him, it would never be told the way he hoped. Perhaps in an act of God, all of the audio recordings and transcripts were ruined beyond repair during a flood at the federal courthouse in Macon. While both Sandy and Barbara did go on to write books regarding their experience with Paul, his legacy was far less prolific than he expected. Even though Paul John Knowles has been nicknamed the Casanova Killer, there's nothing charming about a man who slaughters innocent men, women, and children for fame. There are many people who highlight the fact that Paul was likely a product of his childhood and turned to extreme violence as a result of trauma and abuse.
You really are saying that you believe you have a criminal mind? Well, it's been through the roof. My life has been more involved in the criminal sense than with the empathy. I realized there was a lack of, maybe not a lack of love, but a lack of caring among women. So I have no doubt that they love me, but they just didn't get me.
Nonetheless, there are far more victims who have experienced similar or even worse situations, but don't go on to terrorize other people. I also want to commemorate the countless members of law enforcement across the country, and even citizens right here in Georgia who helped to get Paul John Knowles off the street. This story serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that lies within some members of our society. But I hope that by telling it, we can pay tribute to his victims rather than glorifying his crimes. This has been Joshua John with Behind the Headlines. Until next time, stay safe.